She was never on the manifest, never given a call sign. While the others suited up under floodlights and barked last-minute orders, Jessie stood back, silent beside the equipment bay, adjusting a hovercraft no one had authorized. When the mission brief was read aloud, her name wasn't spoken. It wasn't a mistake. It was protocol. And then everything changed. A single broken transmission, a surf line gone dark, and the only person who had warned them was already walking toward the water, gloves on, route memorized, waiting for no one. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story intrigues you, please consider subscribing to hear more untold stories of extraordinary service and the heroes who walk among us, never asking for the recognition they deserve. Waves tapped against the bulkhead like a metronome, steady and uninvited. Jessie sat alone at the far corner of the operations tent, her boots resting on the plastic lip of a storage crate. The rest of the room was filled with flight suits and fresh coffee, and voices louder than the data they ignored. She had been up since 4, same as every morning before a coastal deployment, charting tidal shifts against wind overlays and drawing new inlets by hand. Her map lay unfolded across her knees, grease pencil marks traced across its laminate surface, corrected and rechecked. She didn't need the base software to tell her what the coastline had done. The erosion at the southern shore had accelerated again. The satellite overlays from 3 days ago were already outdated. What had been a narrow entry was now a natural choke point, no wider than 20 meters and pulling cross-current as the moon climbed. She'd told them. Twice. The first time in writing, with tide tables clipped to her field log. The second, at the pre-mission review, where her voice barely carried over the sound of the projector fan. Commander Miles hadn't even looked up. He'd waved her off with a half smile and a low comment about how the shoreline had been there longer than she had. Now the assignment board told the rest of the story. Her name had been printed under deployment prep earlier that week. Jessie Maddox, Coastal Insertion Specialist, Unit Ready. She stood beside it this morning and saw the red line scratched through it, replaced with a smaller one beneath Logistics Support. The stroke was hard enough to tear the laminate. No initials. Just absence. Razor 6 was already on deck. They stood with arms crossed and gear tight, nodding along as Miles ran through the mission outline like a man auditioning for command. Jessie remained in the shadow of the sidewall, outside the arc of attention, her braid tucked under a cap, her grease-stained gloves still in her pocket. She didn't interrupt. She knew the drill. The mission would go forward. So would the mistakes. When the meeting broke, the SEALs moved out in a cluster of confidence and casual disrespect. Someone brushed past her shoulder and didn't notice. Another adjusted his vest with the kind of cocky swagger reserved for men too sure they'd never be wrong. Miles passed last. He paused, only long enough to say, "Appreciate the paperwork. Maddox, you've done your part." She nodded once, said nothing, and walked out. The hovercraft bay sat 3 pads west of the ops center. Jessie's craft waited in the far berth, its skirt low and partially folded, shadowed beneath the aluminum canopy. It wasn't marked for deployment. No tag, no crew, but it was clean. The hull had been scrubbed and patched. The belts were tightened, sonar plates realigned. She had overhauled the intake herself just 2 nights ago when no one asked. She pulled her gloves on and slid into the small side hatch. Inside, everything smelled of solvent and salt. The control panel blinked in standby mode, one green light steady in a sea of silence. Jessie flipped a maintenance toggle and listened to the fans spool. Once. Then stop. No vibration. Clean balance. She opened the side panel, ran her hand over the throttle linkage, then checked the emergency kill line, still tied in its corner loop. Still hers. A folded towel sat on the bench beside the control console. Underneath it, her original map, hand-marked, tide corrected, and logged for this exact cycle rested in its plastic sleeve. She didn't touch it. She just looked once, then closed the hatch and sat with her back against the wall. Outside, the sound of boots on concrete rose and faded. Razor 6 loaded out with ceremony, their deployment timed to sunset and camera light. Jessie stayed where she was. No one called her. No one even looked to see who might be behind the tinted panel glass. The fans from their transport kicked up a crosswind as the hangar doors rolled wide. Jessie didn't flinch. She waited until they were gone, then stepped out and walked the edge of the pad, adjusting the tie-down just slightly. One turn of the strap, one check of the lock. The waves beyond the barrier fence were steady now, rising slow. She could hear them over the machinery, over the voices, over everything. She paused beside the nose of her hovercraft and ran her fingers along the edge of the intake duct. It was warm from the sun but carried the scent of salt and readiness. Her utility pouch still hung from the hook inside. Her checklist was folded and sealed beneath the lift fan intake. All the pieces were there. All except the orders. Back inside the tent, the team was already halfway to loadout. Laughter echoed across the lot in bursts. No one said her name. No one repeated her warning. The southern inlet would hold. They said they had run ops there before. They would run them again. Jessie tightened the last strap, folded her gloves back into her belt, and adjusted her cap low over her brow. The wind pulled faintly at the edge of her braid, but she didn't retie it. She turned once toward the horizon where the surf broke in staggered rhythm. She didn't speak. She didn't argue. The hovercraft behind her gleamed in the dying light, every part ready, just not requested. The tide crept in like breath through a cracked door. Jessie stood waist-deep in the pre-dawn surf, the cold biting through the seams of her pants as she traced the pull of the current with her eyes. Foam rolled across the surface in slow arcs, curling around her thighs, then pulling back as the wind shifted from west to northeast. She didn't speak. Her lips barely moved. She simply watched. Her grease pencil tide chart was folded in her jacket, damp at the corners from salt and time. She knew the shape of the inlet better than she knew the inside of her bunk, every eddy and curve, every sandbar and shoal. This morning, the curl at the inlet's mouth had changed. 2 hours ahead of the modeled cycle. The pressure ridge she had warned them about was now visibly narrowing the gap to under 20 meters. Water funneled through with dangerous speed, spinning up a churning seam that collapsed back on itself just below the surface. She stepped backward through the shallows, her boots squelching in the wet sand. Behind her, her own prints marked the only trail on this side of the surf. No one else had come. No one else had measured the shift. She reached the bluff line and knelt, drawing a single chalk mark against a rusted tie post where the ramp met gravel. Then she made another, 4 inches lower than the last. The drop was accelerating. Back at the hovercraft, she peeled off her wet gear and moved inside without a sound. The cabin was clean, organized, and built to her rhythm. Every strap had a place. Every tool fit into a color-coded bin. Patches covered old weld scars on the interior hull. Her checklist, laminated and clipped to the side panel, bore faint grease marks from years of use. She slid the panel open, rechecked the secondary belt tensioner, and adjusted the intake coupler by half a turn. A thermos waited on the dash, its black finish dulled with scratches. She hadn't sipped it yet. She wouldn't until everything was locked down. She placed a hand against the throttle and held it there. The surface was cold, but familiar. She didn't turn the engine over. Not yet. Inside the operations tent, the mood was casual. Boots scuffed linoleum, and laughter rose between cups of instant coffee. Someone mentioned the wind. Another joked that Razor 6 was probably already soaked. A third muttered something about Jessie's old warnings, sounding more like bedtime stories than mission notes. No one lowered their voice. No one wondered if she could hear. The tent's heater hissed softly as the CO2 alarm chirped its scheduled alert. Nobody got up. Jessie remained outside. She didn't answer. She was beneath the canopy now, tightening the tie straps on the hull mounts one last time. The fan skirt had been sealed. The intake was clean. Her spare supply net was lashed to the secondary support rails, double knotted. She checked the chalk marks again. Then she checked her boots. Inside her hovercraft, she tucked her pencil back into the frame rail, where it always waited. The tide chart she'd used since training was taped against the inner wall, its corners curled from years of damp wind and night adjustments. Dozens of annotations marked in her own hand looped across the coastline. Most of them were now out of date. This morning, she would have added a new one, but she didn't have to. She already knew it by heart. She climbed onto the forward deck and swept the last of the dew from the hatch lip. Her gloves creaked at the knuckle seams, salt-dried and stiff from overuse. She'd patched them twice. She would do it again if they held through the week. She set them beside the winch handle and stepped back onto the ramp. The light outside changed just slightly. Fog rolled low across the gravel. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the horizon held a dull, iron-blue gleam. Jessie pulled on her gloves, flexed each hand once, then rested them at her sides. She didn't wait for orders. She didn't expect permission. She stepped back from the ramp and looked out toward the surf. The wind had shifted again, stronger now, not hard, not loud, just certain. Behind her, the hovercraft sat fully prepped, locked down, loaded to spec. She had done it alone, without question, without oversight. No one had asked her to move a single part. She had moved them all anyway. The first radio burst came just after 2 a.m. A sharp click, a clipped transmission, then static, in the command tent. The room fell quiet. Commander Miles raised his head slowly from a flight log and stared at the speaker mounted above the wall panel. Another burst, shorter, then a voice, distant and broken by static. The only words clear were, "Contact, need cover, 2 down." The watch officer leaned over the console, tapping the frequency dial with 2 fingers. "Repeat last. Say again. Confirm team location." Silence followed, then one word funnel. That was all. Miles stood without speaking. The officers around him shifted slightly, unsure whether to prepare or wait. Fog had crept in since midnight. Visibility was down to 40 meters and dropping. Drone footage was impossible. The primary exfil boat had been pulled due to unstable surf. And now Razor 6 was pinned in the exact stretch Jessie had warned them about. She didn't speak. She stood near the back of the tent, just beyond the edge of the blue light, a clipboard in one hand. No one had asked her to be there. She came anyway. Same as always. A runner burst through the flap. Younger, breathless. They're under fire. He gasped, confirmed small arms. One man hit, another unresponsive. No movement. The room snapped alert, but Miles didn't move. He exhaled and rubbed his brow. No line of sight. No viable route in. "We wait for daylight." One of the junior officers shifted. "They don't have daylight, sir." "We're not risking another asset on guesswork," Miles snapped. "The surf's unstable. The inlet hasn't been reconfirmed. We'll hold position and reassess at dawn." Jessie turned. Slowly. Her braid tapped against her shoulder. She didn't look at anyone. She didn't offer an opinion. She walked out. Outside. The fog pressed low over the pad. The gravel was slick with mist, and her boots left clean marks across it as she made her way to the hovercraft bay. The hatch was sealed. The tie-downs were still set from the night before. She moved fast but quiet. She opened the maintenance panel, slid inside, and powered up the interior diagnostics. Everything lit clean. She reached into her side pouch and pulled out a folding knife. She didn't hesitate. She gripped her braid at the base and cut it short. The sound was soft, final. She tied the shortened hair back with a black cord and set the braid down beside the console. Her gloves were already waiting, curled beside the throttle. She pulled them on, checked the seams, and cracked each knuckle once. Then she reached for the ignition lever. Inside the tent, someone shouted, "She's powering up the hovercraft." By the time Miles reached the door, Jessie was already clear of the pad. The fans lifted in a low whine, the blade skirt catching the edge of the gravel with a hiss. The hovercraft surged forward, cutting across the surf like it belonged there. "She's unauthorized," he barked. "She's moving fast," one of the officers said, watching through the binoculars. No one followed. Inside the hovercraft, Jessie adjusted the throttle slightly. Her eyes scanned the horizon, though she couldn't see more than a line of foam and shadow. The inlet's edge loomed somewhere ahead, masked by the fog she had studied every day for a month. Her chart was folded beside her seat. Her route was memorized. She didn't need visuals. She had tides. The fan hum deepened as the skirt hit a sandbar, then skimmed. The nose dipped once. She adjusted, lifted, balanced. The radio on her dash cracked again. A voice came through, faint but panicked. "We're still here. No movement. Bleed rate climbing. No exit." Jessie pressed one hand against the throttle housing and felt its vibration steady. Her glove was stiff, her posture relaxed. She didn't respond to the transmission. She didn't break pace. Inside the operations tent, Miles paced tight circles. "Get someone on comms. Order her back." "She's out of range." "Try again." "She's not answering." Another officer stepped forward. She knew the route. "Sir, she marked it last week. She's the only one who can run it blind." Miles didn't answer. Jessie hit the last marker buoy with a glancing bounce. The craft slid left, then forward. Water fanned outward in long arcs. Fog closed in again, rolling heavy over the surface. She slowed the fans just enough to mute the sound, drifting like a ghost. Ahead, in the dark, somewhere behind the last dune, Razor 6 waited. She knew the terrain. She knew the slope angle, the tidal shelf, and the blind edge just before the tree break. Her hands tightened. Her eyes didn't blink. She pulled a small cord and flipped the craft into manual override. The light on the dash shifted from green to orange. Below her, the surf flattened. Inside the tent, the command radio stuttered. A second voice came on, weak, unfamiliar. "Rescue inbound." No one replied. Jessie didn't need an answer. She reached forward, opened the gear bin, and pulled the field harness from its loop. She strapped in. She set her anchor hook. Her tools were clipped along the inner belt in perfect order. Everything was where it belonged. The fog thickened again. Her path narrowed. The hovercraft tilted once in crosswind and corrected. She reached up, tapped the interior light off, and leaned forward into the view. Back at base, the tent fell quiet. Jessie vanished into the surf. Direction locked. Heading into danger? Unasked. Unseen. The fog was thicker on shore. Jessie cut the engines 300 meters from the brake line and let the hovercraft drift. The fans slowed to a hush, then stopped completely. The skirt flexed once as the hull settled into the shallows, gliding forward with only the hiss of water against reinforced fabric. She reached for the anchor, dropped it over the side, and felt it catch soft silt beneath the tide. She moved quickly, locking the instrument panel and shouldering her rig pack. The fog was cold and wet against her face. Her hair was tied close, her gloves cinched tight at the wrist. Every movement was deliberate, every step practiced. She stepped off the nose-lip and waded through thigh-high surf, boots pulling against the sand until she reached the dry rise of the first dune. Gunfire cracked once in the distance, then silence, then another burst, sharper, nearer. The sound didn't carry long in the fog. It stopped just as fast as it started. Jessie crouched low and climbed, hands sinking into loose gravel, boots silent. The fog made the light vanish. There were no shadows, just sound. She moved by ear. At the top of the dune, she dropped to her stomach and listened. The rhythm was wrong. No coordination. Return fire came late, scattered. That meant someone was down, probably more than one. She adjusted her pack, unzipped the top panel, and pulled free the narrow litter rig she had folded and stowed days ago. Sliding down the far side of the dune, she felt the soft dip where loose sand gave way to stone. That's where they had stopped. She could smell cordite and sweat, faint under the surf. Someone coughed. She stayed low and moved forward on her elbows. Her boot treads left clean prints in the sand. First contact came with the edge of a shoulder gear webbing, damp with blood. She followed it with her hand and found the curve of a helmet. "Don't move," she whispered. Her voice barely registered. The seal jerked slightly but didn't speak. She pressed her hand to his vest, felt the breathing. Stable. Farther in, the team lead was slumped against a crumbling mound of root and sand. His name tag caught a fleck of moonlight through the fog. Pace. His left leg was twisted under him, blood soaked through the thigh panel. Jesse dropped beside him and pulled his belt tight across the upper leg. He groaned but didn't wake. She worked fast, tourniquet applied, chest checked, breathing shallow. She tapped his cheek. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, then widened. "You?" he rasped. "You weren't supposed to be here," he added. His voice was hoarse, broken. "You were," she said. He stared at her, tried to speak, couldn't. She turned away and reached for the next man, then the next, one by one. No spotlight, no orders, just pulse checks and quiet adjustments. She pulled their legs straight, checked pupils, counted breaths. The fog moved low between them like a tide, damp and cold, silent. Another round cracked overhead. She didn't flinch. She pressed her hand to one chest and felt the rise, then the pause, then the next breath. Behind her, someone shifted. "Who is that?" one whispered. "She's not cleared. She's got them breathing," another said. Jesse didn't look up. She finished tying off the last splint, then unfolded the litter. The material unrolled in a crisp line. She slid it beneath Pace's back and adjusted the straps. His skin was pale, but his breathing had steadied. The bleeding had slowed. She moved from man to man, rechecking bindings and nodding without words. One seal followed her lead. Another sat up slowly, grimacing through the pain in his ribs. They recognized the order in her movement, even if they didn't know what to call it. She signaled with her fingers low, flat, clear. One man crawled forward, took the front handle. The fog thinned slightly as the wind shifted offshore. A faint glint of light passed across the upper dunes. Together, they lifted. The hovercraft was waiting, invisible beyond the ridge, her tether line pulled tight in the surf. They started to move. The fog split open in thin strands as Jesse led the first body down the slope. The litter slid behind her, one hand guiding the handle, the other pressed flat to the wounded man's ribs. Behind her, two seals moved low, one limping badly, the other covering their path with a raised rifle. The sounds of gunfire were behind them now, distant and sparse. The return fire had stopped. Either the attackers had fallen back or were waiting in silence. Jessie didn't look back. Her boot slid once in loose sand, but she caught herself before she went down. She tightened her grip on the strap and nodded toward the rise. One of the men understood immediately and shifted forward to take some of the weight. The man on the litter groaned faintly, head rolling to the side. Unconscious, but still breathing. When they crested the last dune, the hovercraft came into view. It sat low in the tide like a shadow waiting to lift. Fog slid around it in slow curls. Jessie saw the tether line still taut and pulled it by feel, letting the craft drift closer before cutting the line with her knife. The skirt bumped softly against the sand. She reached the ramp first and dropped to one knee, checking the fan guards and stabilizer mounts. No damage. No blockage. She ran her hand along the intake panel. Still clean. Still ready. The others arrived behind her. She guided the litter up first, then turned and helped the limping seal climb. He winced but moved without complaint, blood darkening the fabric above his boot. "Get down. Hold pressure there," she said, pointing to the injured man's thigh. The seal obeyed without hesitation. Jessie moved fast. She strapped each one in by hand, chest belts, side nets, even tension. She double-checked buckles and anchor rings, no shortcuts, no hesitations. Every strap passed her inspection. She tucked in their arms, looped the belts, set the brace locks. She worked like she had trained alone for this very moment. Maybe she had. She turned last to the team leader. Pace's eyes were open now. Barely. He stared at her without speaking. She pressed her hand to his arm, then to his pulse. It was steady, but shallow. His lips parted slightly. No sound came out. "We're lifting," she said. "Keep your head down." He blinked once, slowly, like a man trying to separate dream from memory. Jessie climbed into the cockpit and pulled the canopy closed. The fans started in a low hum, then rose to a growl. The skirt inflated and lifted. She gripped the throttle with both hands and let her breathing slow. Wind moved in from the north. The surf shifted. She reversed hard and felt the hull slide off the sand with a lurch. Spray shot outward in a fan. The craft tilted slightly, then corrected. The fog made visibility poor, but she knew the line. Her course followed the one she had drawn 2 weeks earlier on a map no one wanted. She didn't need a visual horizon. She had numbers, wind speed, drift, drop line. A shadow rose on the bluff behind them. Flash, crack. Gunfire stitched across the top of the dune. Bullets hit sand and kicked up a wave of dust and seawater. One struck the side panel of the hovercraft and ricocheted. Another thudded against the tail guard. Jessie didn't flinch. She adjusted throttle and pitch, letting the angle ride them lower over the water. The skirt flexed but held. Inside, one seal ducked lower, eyes wide. "Who the hell is she?" Pace's voice came from the stretcher, faint but certain. "She's the reason we're not dead." The fans rose in pitch. The noise became everything. Wind, water, rotor hum, all overlapping into one steady roar. Jessie's hands stayed calm. Her grip was light but anchored. She didn't oversteer. She didn't overcorrect. She just moved. Salt streaked the glass in front of her. She tapped the wiper once, cleared a streak, then set her eyes forward again. She adjusted the rudder trim by one notch and pulled the comm headset around her ears. The ride back was rough. Crosswinds clipped them as the coastline curved. Spray bounced against the lower hull. She checked her positioning against the shoreline drift, corrected 5 degrees, and powered forward. Her hand stayed steady on the throttle. One motion, one purpose. Every few seconds, she glanced back through the split panel to check on the team. No one had slipped from their harness. One man had passed out. Another was holding gauze to his arm. The limping seal gripped a post and stared straight ahead, face streaked with blood and disbelief. Jessie turned back to the controls. Her headset was around her neck. She hadn't used it all night. Now she clicked it on, adjusted the mic, and keyed the base channel. Med Bay, prepare inbound. 1 critical, 2 stable, 1 walking wounded. There was silence, then a static break. Call sign. She didn't answer. She powered harder, lifting the nose slightly as the pad came into view. The fans cut a groove through the surf, flattening waves as they rode in fast. The airfield lights flickered once in the distance. The fog pulled back just enough to show the edge of the ramp. The wounded breathed in rhythm behind her, like a choir barely holding together. The hovercraft roared into the inlet, and the base came into view. The fog folded shut behind them, like a door closing. Jessie didn't look back. The hovercraft settled onto the pad with a soft groan, its fans winding down in staggered pitches. Dust kicked up across the asphalt as medics ran in, their stretchers already unfolded, their vests marked with red tape. One technician threw a signal cone to clear the path. Another waved from the corner of the med tent. Everything moved fast now. Jessie stayed in the seat long enough to power down all systems. She flipped the last switch, pulled the headset from her ears, and hung it back on the dash. Then she opened the hatch and stepped down. Her gloves were still on. Her boots hit the ground with a thud that no one seemed to notice over the noise of orders and stretcher clamps. The SEALs were carried out one by one. One man limped under his own weight. Another had to be braced between 2 medics. Jessie didn't help. She had already done what she came to do. Commander Miles stormed into view before the last medic cleared the side of the craft. His voice was sharp even before he was in range. "You weren't cleared for this mission. You disobeyed direct instruction. You put yourself and others at risk. One of the SEALs turned his head, slowly. His arm was in a sling, his vest soaked through with blood and sand. He raised one hand, palm out, fingers still shaking from cold. "Shut it." Miles stopped mid-step. Another SEAL passed behind Jessie and put a hand on her shoulder. He didn't say a word, just nodded once, then kept moving toward the med line. Jessie said nothing. She didn't slow. She walked right past Miles as if he were a structure, not a man. He opened his mouth to speak again, but didn't. She never looked at him. The noise behind her dimmed as the last of the stretchers cleared the pad. The fog had begun to lift slightly, revealing a line of emergency lights across the far fence. It could have been mistaken for sunrise. Jessie reached the edge of the hovercraft bay and stepped into the small canopy where her tools were kept. The same towel still sat on the bench. Her braid, severed clean, lay folded in the corner of the console shelf. She didn't take her gloves off. She lifted the fan housing with both hands and began to clean the intake grate with a cloth she'd used a dozen times before. The smell of salt and oil lingered in the air. Somewhere behind her, Commander Miles argued with a technician. His voice had dropped now. Not low enough to sound wise, just small. In the quiet, Jessie checked each fan blade for balance, wiped the control housing, reset the fan lock. Then she dropped the rag into her kit and stepped down onto the gravel with a sigh that no one could hear. She reached the back rail of the bay and paused. The light was different now. Early, pale gold coming in from beyond the perimeter road. Her hovercraft gleamed under the halogen mount. Not pretty, not polished, just intact. Inside the cabin, the thermos still sat in its holder, untouched. She stared at it a moment, then stepped up to the edge of the seat. There, sitting on the metal bench where she kept her grease pens, was a patch. Razor 6's insignia, folded, clean, no note, just placed. She reached for it slowly, lifted it with 2 fingers, and turned it in her hand. The stitching was tight, the edges still crisp. It hadn't come from a spare locker. It had been peeled from a uniform. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just placed the patch in the side pouch of her vest and sat down inside the cockpit. The fans were still warm from the ride. The scent of seawater lingered in the vents. She rested her elbows on her knees, took off her gloves, and reached for the thermos. It clicked open in her hand. Outside, the base was coming back to life. A forklift beeped in the distance. A mechanic called out about a leaky manifold. Somewhere, a radio crackled with the next shift's check-in. A gull screamed over the edge of the wind line. Jessie sat in the seat with the sun beginning to rise through the gate. She took a sip and stayed there, eyes forward, while the hovercraft cooled around her. Jessie was never looking for credit. She didn't raise her voice, didn't challenge the roster, and never asked for validation. What she carried was quieter than confidence, it was conviction. While others dismissed her as support staff, she prepared for what no one else could see coming. When everything went wrong, it wasn't orders that moved her. It was readiness, calm, practiced, and absolute. That's the kind of strength you rarely notice until the moment it saves your life. This story reminds us that leadership doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it walks past the noise, straps in, and heads straight for the fog. What part of Jessie's story stayed with you? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. And if these kinds of stories resonate with you, stories of quiet strength and unseen service, consider following us for more. There are more heroes like Jessie. You just don't always see them.